She paid for every centerpiece, every catered bite, every chilled glass of champagne at her sister's $23,000 Hamptons wedding, then was publicly told she wasn't really family and seated at the back like a hired hand. What her parents didn't know was that the woman they'd spent a lifetime dismissing was quietly worth $14 million, held controlling interest in the very venue they'd rented, and had already called her attorney the night before the ceremony. By the time the wedding cake was cut, she didn't just leave the family. She made them wish they'd never said her name. Before we get into how this woman turned one of the worst nights of her life into the most powerful moment of it, we have to ask you something. If your own parents looked you in the eye at your sister's wedding, after you'd paid for everything and said, "You were never really one of us," would you walk away in silence, or would you make absolutely sure they never forgot what they threw away? Drop your answer in the comments right now, and don't forget to like and subscribe before this story gets any darker. Because trust us, it gets so much darker. Her name was Vivienne Cole, and she had learned very early in life that in the Cole household, there were two kinds of daughters, the one who was celebrated and the one who was useful. Vivienne was the useful one. She was the eldest by 4 years. Born first, loved least, at least that was how it had always felt, though she spent the better part of her childhood trying to convince herself otherwise. Her sister, Daniela, arrived in the spring of 1990 with wide blue eyes and a dimpled smile that made their mother, Patricia Cole, burst into the kind of soft, breathless tears that Vivienne had never once managed to produce in her. From the moment Daniela was placed in a hand-embroidered bassinet in the nursery of their Westchester home, the architecture of the Cole family quietly but permanently shifted. Vivienne felt the shift like a draft beneath a closed door. Invisible but undeniable. Their father, Gerald Cole, was a man who made money easily and spent it on the things that made him look important: tailored suits from a bespoke shop on Madison Avenue, a membership at a golf club in Greenwich, a silver gray Mercedes that he polished on Sunday mornings with the devotion of a man who believed his car understood him better than his wife did. He was not cruel exactly. He was something more insidious than cruel. He was indifferent. To Vivienne, at least. To Daniela, he was present in the way that proud fathers are present. At every recital, every softball game, every parent-teacher conference where her teachers said things like delightful and natural leader, and a real joy to have in class. Vivienne's teachers said things like focused and diligent, and unusually self-sufficient for her age. Her parents received these reports with small, polite nods, as though the teachers were describing a piece of furniture. Well-made, reliable, unremarkable. She was 15 when she first understood that her position in the family was not temporary. It was structural. She had stayed up past midnight finishing a business proposal for a school entrepreneurship competition, a 10-page document she'd typed herself, bound herself, and rehearsed presenting in front of her bedroom mirror for 3 nights straight. She won. First place. A $500 scholarship check, and a handshake from the district superintendent. She came home that afternoon glowing, holding the certificate in both hands, and found her parents in the kitchen organizing a birthday party for Daniela. 11 years old, pink balloons, a fondant cake shaped like a horse. Her mother glanced at the certificate. "That's nice, Viv," then turned back to counting paper plates. Her father didn't look up from the balloon he was attempting to tie. "How many are coming tomorrow, Patty?" Did Daniela's friends RSVP? Vivienne placed the certificate on the counter and went upstairs. She didn't cry. She was already learning not to. By the time she graduated high school, valedictorian, full academic scholarship to NYU Stern School of Business, the family's dynamic had calcified into something so normalized it barely required acknowledgement. Daniela was the golden child. Vivienne was the one who figured things out. Daniela's college tuition, a private liberal arts school in Vermont with a price tag of $62,000 per year, was paid without question by Gerald and Patricia, who refinanced a portion of the Westchester house to do it. Vivienne's NYU scholarship covered her tuition, and she worked 25 hours a week at a financial consulting firm to cover room and board, building a resume and a savings account simultaneously, operating with the quiet ferocity of someone who understood that no one was coming to save her. She graduated with a 3.94 GPA, a $14,000 savings account, 3 professional references who described her in superlatives, and a mother who called on graduation day to tell her that Daniela had just been cast as the lead in her college's spring musical, and wasn't that just wonderful? "Congratulations, Viv," Patricia added, almost as an afterthought. Your father says well done. By 31, Vivienne Cole was a principal at Thornfield Capital, a boutique private equity firm headquartered in a glass tower on Park Avenue where the coffee cost more than most people's lunches, and the conference rooms were named after famous economists. She had built her career the way she had built everything in her life, methodically, without ceremony, through sheer and sustained force of will. She specialized in distressed asset acquisitions, finding companies bleeding out, understanding exactly why, and restructuring them into profitable entities. She was very, very good at it. Her colleagues respected her. Her clients trusted her. Her bosses paid her exceptionally well and occasionally forgot to invite her to the golf weekends in the Hamptons, which suited her fine. She lived in a clean, well-appointed apartment in Murray Hill, not ostentatious, but quietly expensive in the way that only people who knew what things cost could appreciate. Custom built-ins. Sub-zero refrigerator. Original oil paintings she'd selected herself from a gallery in Chelsea. No roommates. No clutter. Every surface earning its place. Her personal life was quieter. She had friends, professional, loyal, the kind of people who showed up when it mattered. She had dated carefully and let each relationship end with more grace than it deserved. She was not lonely. She was self-contained, which is a different thing, though some people, her mother primarily, found it impossible to tell the difference. You work too much, Patricia would say on their monthly phone calls, which lasted exactly as long as they needed to and no longer. You should be more like Daniela. She knows how to enjoy life. Daniela, at 27, had enjoyed life extensively. She had cycled through 3 careers: photography, interior design, and artisanal candle making, with the conviction and staying power of a summer storm. She had lived in 3 cities, borrowed money from her parents 6 separate times, and was currently engaged to a man named Bryce Whitmore, whose primary qualification appeared to be his family's connection to a resort property on Long Island Sound and a confidence so unearned it looped all the way around into something almost admirable. The engagement was announced at Christmas dinner 3 years ago. Patricia wept beautifully into a linen napkin. Gerald shook Bryce's hand with the warmth he reserved for men he wanted something from. Daniela's ring, a 3-carat oval diamond on a pave band, caught the light from the dining room chandelier in a way that Patricia noted twice was absolutely stunning. Vivienne smiled and said congratulations and meant it with at least 60% of her heart, which was more than Daniela had ever offered her in return. The wedding was set for 18 months out, June, at a coastal estate property called Saltmarsh Manor in the Hamptons. The venue alone ran $18,000 for the weekend rental. When Vivienne made the mistake of asking casually whether the couple had a budget in place, Patricia's expression shifted in a way that Vivienne recognized immediately. The slight tightening around the eyes, the small compression of the lips that meant a request was incoming, dressed in the clothes of an assumption. We were actually hoping you might help with some of the planning expenses, Patricia said. You're doing so well. And it would mean the world to Daniela. Family helps family. Family helps family. Vivienne would think about those words for a very long time afterward. She said yes, because she always said yes to them, not from weakness, but from a place deep inside her that still, despite everything, held the architecture of a daughter who wanted her parents to look at her the way they looked at Daniela. Just once. With warmth that didn't require a transaction. So she paid. She paid for the floral arrangements, a Dutch-inspired cascade of white garden roses, ranunculus, and eucalyptus that the florist quoted at $4,800. She paid the catering deposit, $6,200, to a firm out of Southampton that did past appetizers, a seated 5-course dinner, and a late-night raw bar. She paid for the wedding invitations, the calligraphy addressing service, the custom ribbon, the wax seals, $1,100 total. She arranged the transportation for out-of-town guests. A shuttle from the Bridgehampton into the venue, $800. She covered the rehearsal dinner at a waterfront restaurant in Sag Harbor, $3,400 for 40 guests, including a per-head wine pairing she had specifically suggested to make her parents look generous. She negotiated the photographer's package, a videographer, the string quartet for the ceremony, and a DJ for the reception, adding up to $6,700, and paid it all out of a personal checking account without a single complaint, a single request for acknowledgement, or a single moment of hesitation that anyone could see. The total, by the week before the wedding, was $23,000 and some change. She had never received a thank you note. Not a handwritten one, not an emailed one, not so much as a text that used the word grateful. What she received instead were revisions. The florist needed to add peonies because Daniela had changed her mind about the aesthetic. The caterer needed a full allergen revision because 3 of Bryce's cousins had dietary requirements that no one had thought to mention. The shuttle needed an additional vehicle because the guest list had expanded by 11 people at the 6-week mark. Every change came through Patricia, relayed to Vivienne like a memo from a manager to a subordinate, with a tone that somehow implied that Vivienne's handling of these details was expected rather than extraordinary. 3 weeks before the wedding, Vivienne flew to the Hamptons for a venue walkthrough. She stood in the airy main hall of Saltmarsh Manor, wide plank oak floors, cathedral ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Saltmarsh and the Sound beyond, and listened to the venue coordinator walk through the timeline while Patricia fussed over table linen samples and Daniela scrolled through Instagram looking at other people's weddings and Bryce stood by a window eating from a bag of chips he'd brought in without apology. Nobody asked Vivienne what she thought. Nobody introduced her to the coordinator as the person paying for the event. When the coordinator turned to the group and said, "And the bride's family has approved the layout?" Patricia and Gerald both nodded, and the coordinator moved on without Vivienne's eyes finding hers once. She was invisible in the room she was financing. On the drive back to the city that evening, she sat in the passenger seat of her rental car in the Saltmarsh Manor parking lot for 4 full minutes before starting the engine. The sun was going down over the water. The light was pink and gold and absurdly beautiful. She watched it until it started to hurt. Then she started the car and drove back to New York. She found the papers by accident, the way the most life-altering discoveries always seem to arrive. Not through grand revelation, but through a small, ordinary moment that slides sideways into something else entirely. It was 9 days before the wedding. She was at her parents' Westchester house for what Patricia had called a family dinner and final coordination meeting, which in practice meant Vivienne sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad going through vendor timelines while Patricia heated up a grocery store rotisserie chicken and Daniela FaceTimed Bryce from the living room couch, laughing at something Vivienne couldn't hear. Gerald was in his study, ostensibly reviewing some paperwork, which had been his stated activity for most of Vivienne's childhood, and which she had long since understood meant watching financial news on the small television he kept on his desk. She went to the study to ask him something routine, whether he and Patricia intended to take 1 vehicle or 2 to the rehearsal dinner, and found the door slightly open, Gerald not at his desk, and a manila folder sitting open on the leather surface of the desk beside his keyboard. She would not have glanced at it at all if a specific phrase hadn't caught her eye from the doorway, printed in the clean serif typeface of a legal document. Estate distribution. Non-biological heir exclusion. She stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds. Then she stepped inside. The document was from a law firm, Hartwell & Crane, an estate planning practice in White Plains. It was a will amendment dated 8 months prior. It specified in the measured, unhurried language of legal drafting that the estate of Gerald Franklin Cole and Patricia & Cole, valued in the document at approximately $2.3 million inclusive of the Westchester property, investment accounts and personal property, was to be divided as follows: 100% to Daniela Rose Cole, sole biological heir. The document further referenced an original will that had, 8 months ago, divided the estate equally between both daughters. And then she found the second document beneath it. A private DNA test, ordered through a laboratory in Connecticut. Gerald Cole. Subject 1. Vivienne and Cole. Subject 2. The results section used clinical, impersonal language to confirm what the estate amendment had already implied. No biological relationship detected. She read it twice. Then she set it down exactly where she had found it and walked back to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and picked up her legal pad and her pen. Her hand was steady. Patricia was standing at the counter slicing the rotisserie chicken into portions, her back to the room, talking about whether the escort cards should be alphabetized by first or last name. Vivienne wrote escort cards, alpha by last name on the legal pad and said, "Last name is more traditional. Guests expect it." Patricia said, "That's what I thought. Daniela wanted first, but I think it looks messy." "Last name," Vivienne confirmed. Her voice was even. Her handwriting on the pad was even. Inside her chest, something had gone completely perfectly still. The way a city goes still in the seconds before a storm makes landfall, when the air pressure drops and the birds stop and the world holds its breath. She drove back to New York at 10:15 that night. She was on the phone with her attorney, Marcus Webb of Webb & Associates on Lexington Avenue, at 7:15 the following morning. I handled it badly. I have thought about it for 31 years. They talked for 2 hours. She did not cry until after she hung up. Even then, it was only for a few minutes. She was not, by nature, a woman who cried for long. The week before the wedding moved the way weeks before weddings always do, in a blur of logistics and minor crises and people behaving worse than usual because the occasion licensed it. Daniela called 3 times to report emergencies of escalating absurdity, the wrong shade of ivory for the napkin rings, a bridesmaid who had cut her hair without permission, a concern that the rehearsal dinner menu was too coastal for Bryce's family from Ohio, as though the Sag Harbor waterfront restaurant had been selected with Bryce's family's preferences as any kind of priority. Vivienne resolved each crisis with the same flat efficiency. She had the napkin rings reordered in the correct ivory. She told Daniela the bridesmaid's hair was irrelevant to the photographs if the photographer was competent, which theirs was. She called the restaurant and arranged a supplemental comfort food station, sliders, kettle chips, a mac and cheese option, that satisfied the Ohio contingent without alienating the rest of the guests or the culinary integrity of the original menu. She charged it to her personal card. It came to $420. Nobody thanked her. The night before the wedding, Vivienne checked into a room at the Bridgehampton Inn, a clean white shingled place with a porch overlooking a garden, and sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in her hand. She had one final call to make. She made it to Marcus, who confirmed that everything was in place. She made it to Helen Chu, who confirmed the same. She made it to a woman named Diane Forsyth, a journalist at a regional lifestyle and society publication called The Sound, which covered Hampton's social events with the thoroughness of a publication that understood its readership's appetite for stories about the wealthy behaving badly. Diane was a professional contact of 2 years' standing. Vivienne told her only that something newsworthy might occur at a private family event the following afternoon, and that if Diane happened to be near Saltmarsh Manor, she might want to have her record her. Then she ordered room service, a club sandwich and a glass of Sancerre, and went to sleep at 10:30, because she had never in her life allowed anxiety to steal her rest. The wedding day arrived in the way that late June days in the Hamptons arrive when they've decided to be perfect. Clear sky, sea air, the light doing that specific thing it does near the water where everything looks slightly more saturated than real life, like the opening frame of a film. Saltmarsh Manor was prepared immaculately. The white garden roses and ranunculus were exactly as Vivienne had specified to the florist 8 weeks prior. Lush but not overwrought, the eucalyptus adding a green-gray softness that photographed beautifully. The round tables were set with ivory linen, low floral centerpieces, and the gold-rimmed glassware Vivienne had selected from the rental catalog. The string quartet was already in position at the far end of the ceremony lawn, playing Vivaldi's Four Seasons with practiced ease. The caterers moved efficiently through the service entrance, and the past appetizer trays, burrata crostini, smoked salmon blinis, fig and prosciutto skewers, emerged at exactly the right moment for the pre-ceremony cocktail hour. Vivienne arrived at 12:30. She was wearing a midi-length dress in deep forest green. Not a brand that required announcement, but impeccably cut, the kind of garment that communicated its cost without advertising it. Her dark hair was pulled back cleanly. She wore pearl earrings and low-heeled sandals. She looked as she had intended to look, exactly like a woman who had everything under control and nothing to prove. I handled it badly. I have thought about it for 31 years. They talked for 2 hours. She did not cry until after she hung up. Even then, it was only for a few minutes. She was not, by nature, a woman who cried for long. The week before the wedding moved the way weeks before weddings always do, in a blur of logistics and minor crises and people behaving worse than usual because the occasion licensed it. Daniela called 3 times to report emergencies of escalating absurdity, the wrong shade of ivory for the napkin rings, a bridesmaid who had cut her hair without permission, a concern that the rehearsal dinner menu was too coastal for Bryce's family from Ohio, as though the Sag Harbor waterfront restaurant had been selected with Bryce's family's preferences as any kind of priority. Vivienne resolved each crisis with the same flat efficiency. She had the napkin rings reordered in the correct ivory. She told Daniela the bridesmaid's hair was irrelevant to the photographs if the photographer was competent, which theirs was. She called the restaurant and arranged a supplemental comfort food station, sliders, kettle chips, a mac and cheese option, that satisfied the Ohio contingent without alienating the rest of the guests or the culinary integrity of the original menu. She charged it to her personal card. It came to $420. Nobody thanked her. The night before the wedding, Vivienne checked into a room at the Bridgehampton Inn, a clean white shingled place with a porch overlooking a garden, and sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in her hand. She had one final call to make. She made it to Marcus, who confirmed that everything was in place. She made it to Helen Chu, who confirmed the same. She made it to a woman named Diane Forsyth, a journalist at a regional lifestyle and society publication called The Sound, which covered Hampton's social events with the thoroughness of a publication that understood its readership's appetite for stories about the wealthy behaving badly. Diane was a professional contact of 2 years standing. Vivienne told her only that something newsworthy might occur at a private family event the following afternoon, and that if Diane happened to be near Saltmarsh Manor, she might want to have her recorder. Then she ordered room service, a club sandwich and a glass of Sancerre, and went to sleep at 10:30 because she had never in her life allowed anxiety to steal her rest. The wedding day arrived in the way that late June days in the Hamptons arrive when they've decided to be perfect. Clear sky, sea air, the light doing that specific thing it does near the water where everything looks slightly more saturated than real life, like the opening frame of a film. Saltmarsh Manor was prepared immaculately. The white garden roses and ranunculus were exactly as Vivienne had specified to the florist 8 weeks prior. Lush but not overwrought, the eucalyptus adding a green-gray softness that photographed beautifully. The round tables were set with ivory linen, low floral centerpieces, and the gold-rimmed glassware Vivienne had selected from the rental catalog. The string quartet was already in position at the far end of the ceremony lawn, playing Vivaldi's Four Seasons with practiced ease. The caterers moved efficiently through the service entrance, and the past appetizer trays, burrata crostini, smoked salmon blinis, fig and prosciutto skewers, emerged at exactly the right moment for the pre-ceremony cocktail hour. Vivienne arrived at 12:30. She was wearing a midi-length dress in deep forest green. Not a brand that required announcement, but impeccably cut, the kind of garment that communicated its cost without advertising it. Her dark hair was pulled back cleanly. She wore pearl earrings and low-heeled sandals. She looked as she had intended to look, exactly like a woman who had everything under control and nothing to prove, which she was on both counts. The ceremony was at 3 o'clock. Vivienne sat in the third row of the ceremony chairs, not the front row, which was reserved for immediate family, a designation she noted with a small, internal, airless sort of clarity. Her parents sat in the front row. Bryce's parents sat in the front row. Vivienne sat in the third row between a cousin she barely knew and an empty seat that had been intended for a bridesmaid who'd had a travel delay. Daniela came down the aisle in a gown from a designer bridal house in Soho, a structured Align in ivory Duchess satin, $8,400, which Vivienne had paid for as part of an early lump sum that Patricia had assembled without itemization. Bryce stood at the altar in a navy suit, looking confident and slightly damp around the hairline from the afternoon heat. The officiant, a friend of the couple who had ordained himself online as was fashionable, delivered vows that were heartfelt and slightly too long. Daniela cried beautifully. Patricia cried beautifully. Gerald put his arm around Patricia. Vivienne watched all of it with her hands folded in her lap. The cocktail hour was pleasant. The Sancerre was cold. The burrata crostini were excellent. People told Vivienne she looked wonderful and she thanked them and asked about their lives and did not once mention what was coming. It was during the cocktail hour that Gerald Cole found her near the edge of the Saltmarsh overlook, standing with a glass of wine looking out at the water. He came to stand beside her with a bourbon in his hand, and the manner of a man who has something to say and has decided that this is the moment to say it. "You've done a beautiful job with all of this," he said. "Not thank you. Done a beautiful job." "I'm glad it came together," she said. He looked out at the water. He was 63, her father in every legal and social sense, a man she had loved for 30 years with a daughter's helpless persistence. He sipped his bourbon. "Your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking lately. About family. About what family means." She turned to look at him. "Have you?" Blood is a complicated thing, he said, not looking at her. We've always thought of you as our daughter. Of course we have. But there are practical matters that have to be considered. Estate matters. Planning. Gerald. She used his first name. She had not used his first name in 20 years. He looked at her then, slightly startled. Don't do this today, she said. Her voice was completely level. Whatever you have decided to say, do not say it today. He read something in her face. She could see him reading it. Then he looked away. You're right. Not today. He walked back toward the cocktail crowd. Vivienne turned back to the water and finished her wine. It happened during the reception. Dinner had been served. The 5-course menu executed precisely. The lamb perfectly pink. The tuna tartare first course receiving genuine and visible pleasure from the assembled guests. The speeches had been delivered. Bryce's best man, who was funny in a fraternal way. Daniela's maid of honor, who cried through most of hers. Gerald, who spoke about Daniela with the warmth and specificity that Vivienne had spent a lifetime waiting to hear directed at herself. She absorbed it all with the stillness she had spent decades constructing. Then Patricia stood up. It was not planned. Vivienne could see that from the slight surprise on the maid of honor's face, the brief flicker of Gerald's expression. Patricia stood with her champagne glass and the particular brightness of a woman who has had exactly enough to drink to believe that the things she has been carrying privately are better said aloud. I want to say something about family, Patricia began, addressing the 68 guests seated at their tables. Real family. The people who are truly yours. She looked at Daniela with luminous, champagne-softened eyes. Daniela, you are our heart. You always have been. You are everything we hoped for and more. Her voice broke beautifully. Several guests murmured with appreciation. Then Patricia's gaze found Vivienne across the room. What happened next was something Vivienne would replay many times in the months that followed, and each time she replayed it, she arrived at the same conclusion. Patricia had not planned it. It was the champagne and the sentiment and 31 years of treating a truth as something that could be managed indefinitely. It was Patricia being Patricia, performing sincerity so practiced it had become indistinguishable, in her own mind, from the real thing. And for those who've helped along the way, Patricia said with a gracious, benevolent smile aimed at Vivienne, we're grateful. Truly. But some things are just a small, helpless gesture of the free hand. For family. The room absorbed it in a beat of confused silence. A few guests looked at Vivienne with the uncertain expressions of people who sense they have witnessed something they cannot quite categorize. Daniela, to her credit, looked faintly alarmed. Bryce looked at his phone. Vivienne set down her fork. She picked up her champagne glass. She stood up. I'd like to say a few words as well, she said. Her voice carried clearly across the room without effort. She had given presentations to boardrooms of 40. This was 68 people in a string quartet. Patricia blinked. Vivienne. Just a few words, Vivienne said, with a smile so composed it could have been framed. For family. She reached beneath her chair, where a slim leather portfolio had been resting since she sat down for dinner, placed there by her own hand 90 minutes prior, and withdrew it. She opened it on the table. She removed a single document, folded in thirds, and held it loosely in her right hand. Daniela, she said, looking at her sister. You look beautiful today. You really do. I hope you're happy. I genuinely mean that. Daniela's alarmed expression deepened. Vivienne, this isn't. I've been involved in planning this wedding for 14 months, Vivienne continued, addressing the room with the measured cadence of someone who has prepared remarks and intends to deliver them. The flowers you've been admiring this evening, those were my conversations with the florist, my selections, my payment. The dinner you just ate, coordinated and deposited by me. The transportation that brought many of you here, arranged and paid by me. The string quartet, the photographer currently circling the room, the DJ who will be playing in approximately 40 minutes, all arranged and paid by me. The total cost I have personally absorbed for this evening's celebration is $23,040. The room was perfectly still. 68 people doing the mental adjustment that people do when the social contract of an event has been unexpectedly altered. I was happy to do it, she said. I want to be clear about that. I paid because I love my sister, and because I have spent my entire life trying to be enough for the people in this room. She looked at Gerald, then at Patricia. 9 days ago, I found a document in my father's study. A will amendment made 14 months ago, removing me from my parents' estate entirely, because a DNA test, also found in that study, confirmed that Gerald Cole is not my biological father. She paused. I was not told. Not by my parents. Not by anyone. I found it by accident, in a folder on a desk. The silence in the room had changed texture. It was no longer polite. It was the silence of people witnessing something that cannot be unseen. Patricia had gone the color of the ivory napkin rings. Gerald had gone very, very still. I spent 31 years being the daughter who wasn't quite enough, Vivienne said. The one who earned her own way, asked for nothing, paid for everything, and was told implicitly and occasionally explicitly that family was something I was adjacent to rather than part of. I want you all to know, and here she addressed the room openly, with the particular composure of someone who has made peace with something irrevocably, that I am not angry. I am done. She unfolded the document in her hand and laid it on the table in front of her. This is a letter from Marcus Webb of Webb & Associates, who serves as my personal legal counsel. It formally withdraws payment authorization for 2 outstanding vendor invoices, the final catering balance and the DJ's remaining payment, effective immediately. As I am no longer in a position to fund events on behalf of a family, I have been formally excluded from. She smoothed the document with her fingertip. The catering firm and the DJ are aware of this letter and have received separate direct communications. She then reached into the portfolio for a second document. This is a notice from Meridian Asset Holdings LLC, of which I am the sole managing member, exercising a contractual stakeholder notification right with the property management group that holds the master lease on Saltmarsh Manor. I am not canceling the event. I want to be absolutely clear about that. The event continues. But the management group is now formally on notice that the outstanding balance on the facility fee, which was scheduled for final payment by my personal account, will not be remitted by me. She looked at Gerald. The balance owed to Saltmarsh Manor is $4,200. It's due Monday, Bryce said from the head table. What the hell is going on? Your wedding is continuing, Vivienne told him pleasantly. I simply won't be paying for the rest of it. She closed the portfolio. She picked up her champagne glass, finished what remained in it, and set it down on the white linen tablecloth with a small, precise click. Daniela, she said one more time, looking at her sister. I genuinely hope you're happy. That part is true. She picked up her evening bag, pushed her chair back neatly, and walked out of the reception hall through the wide doorway that opened onto the salt marsh overlook. She did not look back. Outside, the evening air was cool and slightly sweet with the smell of the marsh. The sun had dropped behind the horizon and left the sky a deep, saturated blue. She stood on the stone overlook and breathed it in, and for the first time in 31 years she felt something in her chest that she could only identify, after a moment, as weightlessness. Her phone showed a text from Thomas Reyes, sent 3 minutes prior. Thinking of you today. Hope it went okay. She typed back. Better than okay. I'll call you this week. She could hear faintly, through the walls of the manor behind her, the sound of raised voices. She did not go back inside. The weeks that followed had the quality of a controlled demolition, precise, irreversible, conducted at a measured pace that allowed no dramatic intervention. What Vivienne had set in motion was not explosive in its method, only in its results. The catering firm and the DJ, having received formal notification of the payment withdrawal, had acted as contracted service providers do. They called the bride and groom seeking alternative payment arrangements. Bryce Whitmore, operating under the assumption that his family's vague social connections to the Hamptons real estate world constituted the kind of financial security that didn't need examining too closely, discovered over that particular long weekend that it did not. His family covered the DJ, $1,400 grudgingly, through a family Venmo transfer that his mother later told people was a loan. The catering balance was disputed for 11 days before Daniela's maid of honor, a high school friend named Courtney who had more practical instincts than most of the people in Daniela's life, quietly paid it with her own card to prevent a collections action that would have appeared, embarrassingly, in the vendor's online reviews. The Saltmarsh Manor balance of $4,200 was paid by Gerald Cole 4 days after the wedding, via a check that cleared his investment account and generated, According to Patricia's subsequent and escalating series of phone calls to Vivienne, enormous stress, and an overdraft situation that was very upsetting. Vivienne did not answer the calls. She had Marcus send a single letter on her behalf, which stated that she had no outstanding financial obligations to the Cole family and considered the matter closed. The article in The Sound ran 12 days after the wedding under a headline that Diane Forsyth had clearly labored over with some satisfaction. Hampton's wedding moment. When the checkbook speaks back. It did not name names. Diane was a professional and knew the limits of what she could print without counsel, but it described the incident with enough atmospheric specificity that anyone who had been present, or knew someone who had been present, recognized it immediately. The Hamptons social ecosystem, which ran on exactly this kind of story, circulated it efficiently. Gerald Cole received 3 calls from golf club members that week. He did not return them. Daniela called Vivienne 9 days after the wedding. It was the first direct communication since Vivienne had walked out of the reception hall. She called at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday when Vivienne was between meetings, and Vivienne answered because, unlike her parents, Daniela had never lied to her. Had never been warm to her either, truthfully, but lies were a different category of damage. "I didn't know about the will," Daniela said without preamble. "I want you to know that. I didn't know about the DNA thing either." "I believe you," Vivienne said. A silence. "That doesn't mean you're not angry." "I'm not angry at you, Daniela. What about Mom and Dad?" "I'm not angry at them either." It was true, which was the strangest part. "I'm just done." Another silence longer. "Where does that leave us?" Vivienne considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I don't know yet. I know it doesn't have to be nothing, but it can't be what it was." Daniela didn't have an answer for that, and Vivienne didn't expect her to. They said goodbye carefully, like 2 people maneuvering around furniture in a dark room. The estate matter resolved itself in the way these things do when the architecture of deception is exposed to air. It became untenable. Gerald and Patricia's decision to exclude Vivienne from their will had been made under the assumption that she would never know, that the quiet erasure of a daughter from an inheritance could be accomplished without confrontation if no one ever said the word DNA in her presence. Once that assumption collapsed, so did their legal standing to act without consequence. Marcus Webb, reviewing the circumstances, identified 2 avenues of interest. A potential claim based on promissory estoppel. Vivienne had made significant financial contributions to the family over decades in a context that implied ongoing familial relationship and mutual obligation, and a separate inquiry into whether Patricia's conduct constituted actionable misrepresentation. Gerald had a conversation with his own attorney, whose advice was apparently sobering. 4 weeks after the wedding, Vivienne received a formal offer of settlement from Hartwell and Crane. $180,000, representing a negotiated partial distribution from the estate. She accepted, not because she needed it. $180,000 was a number that mattered to her parents and was irrelevant to her own balance sheet, but because Marcus advised her that acceptance was cleaner and faster than litigation, and she had no interest in spending the next 2 years entangled in a legal proceeding that kept these people in her life. The check cleared on a Thursday morning. She donated $50,000 of it to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students at NYU's Stern School. She considered it a form of symmetry. Thomas Reyes came to New York in September. He was a quiet man, solidly built, with an engineer's habit of looking at structures, buildings, bridges, the interior framework of things, with a proprietary attention. He had gray at his temples and Vivienne's same way of going still when he was thinking. They met for dinner at a restaurant in the West Village that she liked for its lack of pretension and its exceptional lamb chops, and they talked for 3.5 hours. He had 2 other children, a son in Seattle, a daughter in Austin, both of whom knew about Vivienne and had responded, he said, with a warmth and curiosity that had surprised him. She said she would think about making contact. She was not ready to acquire a family as quickly as she had divested one. "There's no timeline on it," Thomas said. "I know," she said. "That's actually the part I'm not used to." He laughed. She found unexpectedly that she liked the sound of it. The last time she heard from her parents was a voicemail from Patricia in October, 6 weeks before Thanksgiving. Patricia's voice had the careful brightness of a woman who has had some time to revise her position and is presenting the revision as though it were the original. She talked about how much had changed and how much she'd been reflecting and how family was complicated but ultimately worth fighting for, and how she hoped Vivienne would consider joining them for Thanksgiving. Just the family, a chance to talk. Vivienne listened to the voicemail twice. Then she deleted it. She had plans for Thanksgiving. Thomas Reyes and his family, his son from Seattle, his daughter from Austin, were coming to New York. Vivienne had offered her apartment for the gathering and had been thinking, in the weeks since making the offer, about what it would feel like to set a table for people who had arrived at her life through honesty rather than through obligation. She bought a new set of linen napkins, deep forest green as it happened, the color she had been wearing at the wedding, and a set of wine glasses that she placed in the cabinet and looked at occasionally while deciding what to serve. She had also, in the weeks following the wedding, done something she had been putting off for 2 years at Thornfield Capital. She had formally presented her case for partnership, a detailed portfolio analysis, a client retention record, a projected revenue contribution model, to the firm's founding partners. The presentation took 40 minutes. The partners asked 11 questions. 3 weeks later, they offered her a named partnership at a terms agreement that added, in the first year alone, approximately $900,000 to her compensation package. She signed the agreement on a Friday afternoon, in the same measured way she had signed every document in her career, carefully, without ceremony, knowing that what the paper represented was not the achievement but the acknowledgement of something that had always been true. She called Marcus Webb after she signed. He said congratulations and she said, thank you. And they talked for 4 minutes about the estate matter's final paperwork before hanging up. She sat in her office for a few minutes after the call, looking out the window at Park Avenue in the October light, at the yellow cabs and the delivery trucks and the specific New York afternoon energy of people moving with purpose through a city that doesn't pause for anything, and she thought about the moment she had stood in her parents' kitchen at 15 years old with a first-place certificate in both hands, waiting for someone to look at her. Nobody had looked. The difference was that she understood now, in a way she hadn't then, that the failure had not been hers. The failure belonged to the people who had been given the extraordinary gift of her discipline, her loyalty, her intelligence, her willingness to keep showing up, and had spent 30 years treating it as ordinary. At Thornfield Capital, nobody asked Vivienne how her sister's wedding had gone. This was not unusual. Her personal life was a country her colleagues had learned not to enter without an invitation, and she had never issued many. But on the Monday following the wedding, she arrived at the glass tower on Park Avenue at 7:40 in the morning, made her coffee, sat down at her desk, and opened the analysis she had been working on before the wedding. A distressed retail chain in the Midwest that was hemorrhaging cash from 3 underperforming flagship locations while its e-commerce division showed the early structure of something genuinely salvageable. She spent 4 hours on the report before her first meeting. By noon she had a preliminary deck. By 4 o'clock she had a recommendation. This was who she had always been. The woman who showed up, who did the work, who transformed the things other people had given up on into something that could stand. The days after the wedding had their own particular quality. Not grief exactly, she had grieved in smaller, quieter increments across 31 years, a kind of slow-release mourning that had happened so gradually she'd barely noticed the cumulative weight of it until she set it down. What she felt in its place was something closer to spaciousness. The feeling of a room after furniture has been removed, disorienting at first, the outlines of what was there still faintly visible, but ultimately more breathable, more navigable, more genuinely hers. She kept her routines. Saturday mornings she ran along the Hudson. Sunday evenings she cooked properly, attentively, the kind of cooking that required a recipe and a glass of wine and music she chose based on mood rather than what she thought she should be listening to. She had always cooked alone and always enjoyed it, but there was something different about it now, a quality of choosing it rather than simply inhabiting it. She made lamb ragout on a Sunday in July and ate it at her kitchen table with a book and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was happy. It was a small and private happiness, nothing cinematic about it. No audience, no validation, no one watching. Just a woman at a clean table in a well-appointed kitchen in Murray Hill, eating food she had made herself, in a life she had built by herself from scratch, without a safety net or a family with the right connections or a single person in her corner who didn't have to choose to be there. She had been enough all along. She had simply been spending the energy of enough in the wrong direction. Daniela and Bryce moved to Connecticut after the wedding. into a rental house that Bryce's professional network had recommended as a temporary base, while he figured out his next move. His next move in the year that followed proved somewhat elusive. The resort property connection that had always been the implied foundation of his financial confidence turned out to be a cousin's hospitality management job, not a family ownership stake, which was a distinction that became clarifying rather quickly once anyone asked a direct question. Daniela took on freelance event design work, which suited her creative instincts, and began to show signs of a pragmatism that her previous life had not required. She called Vivienne twice in the year that followed their post-wedding conversation. The calls were short and careful. Two people who had not chosen each other but shared the particular intimacy of a childhood, trying to determine whether that was enough to build something new on, or only enough to acknowledge what had been lost. Gerald and Patricia remained in Westchester. Gerald retired from the financial advisory practice he'd maintained for 30 years and spent increasing amounts of time at the golf club, where he had the particular social position of a man whose past largesse had purchased goodwill that was now being drawn down rather than replenished. Patricia redid the kitchen, sold the dining room table she'd had for 20 years, joined a watercolor class. She called Daniela twice a week. She stopped leaving voicemails for Vivienne after December, which Vivienne noted and felt, for the first time, nothing about at all. The salt marsh at Saltmarsh Manor was very beautiful in the early morning, when the light came low across the water and the reeds caught it and the whole surface of the marsh shimmered with a kind of indifferent, ancient loveliness that had nothing to do with anyone's pain or anyone's triumph and everything to do with the simple fact that the world continued, as it always does, with magnificent unconcern. Vivienne drove out to the Hamptons alone the following June, not for any occasion, just for the weekend, because she had learned in the months since the wedding that she was allowed to do things for no reason other than that she wanted to. She booked a room at the Bridgehampton Inn, walked on the beach, ate oysters at a place with plastic chairs and paper menus that she loved with a fierceness that would have surprised anyone who associated her with the careful elegance of the rest of her life. On Saturday afternoon she drove past Saltmarsh Manor. She didn't stop. She slowed for a moment at the turn, looked at the stone entrance pillars, the cedar-shingled main house visible at the end of the drive, the salt marsh beyond catching the early summer light. Then she drove on. There was nothing there that she needed to revisit. The accounts were settled. The truth had been spoken aloud, in a room full of witnesses, in a voice that had not shaken. She had paid what she owed to the version of herself that had stood in her parents' kitchen at 15 with a certificate in both hands. She owed that girl that much. She had made it right. The road ahead was clean and clear and entirely her own.